turn to 1 Samuel. We're looking at the life of the baby Jesus' great, many greats grandfather, David. We're following David as he's on the run. He's on the run from King Saul since the beginning of chapter 19. If you remember, he took his flight. Here's the map of where he's been. He started out in Gibeah, which Gibeah is where Saul was from. That's where Saul reigned from. We could call it his capital, but any palace that Saul would have had would have been in Gibeah. He ran from Gibeah, he went to Ramah. From Ramah, he came back to Gibeah. Then he went down to, he fled. That was after Jonathan and he had worked out their code with the arrows. And then he ran and he went to Nob. From Nob, he went to Gath. From Gath, remember, where's Gath, real quick? It's in Philistia. So not Goliath of Gath. So he ran to Gath. Then he ran out of Gath. He escaped there and went to the cave at Adullam. That was where people started gathering to him. An army of malcontents, essentially, started flocking to David. And they're forming up. He went from Adullam, he went to Moab. And we mentioned last week, why would he go to Moab? Well, very likely because his great-grandmother, who was, you remember her name? She's got a book of the Bible named after her? Ruth. His great-grandmother was from Moab. So it would make sense that he would return to Moab, where that was where he put his parents in the care of the king of Moab. I mentioned last week, if you dive into the history of it, it's not in the Bible, but according to Jewish history, the king of Moab ended up killing Jesse and David's mother. So it didn't end up working out according to Jewish history, but again, we don't have that on biblical authority. He left Moab and he went to Masada, very likely, called the Hold, which is the Hebrew word Masad. And then from there, last week we saw he went from there to the forests at Hereth, which is somewhere in the territory of Judah. If you look up here on the map, they have it out here in the middle. It's number 9, but if you see it has a question mark because we don't know where the forest of Hereth was, but we do know that it was in the territory of Judah. But tonight, we're not going to be focusing on David so much, but it's important that we remember what has happened to this point because it will factor in. Our main characters this evening are King Saul, Ahimelech, who's the priest, and an Edomite named Doeg. But we're going to look here in chapter 22. We're going to start. We're going to go back just a little bit so that we can get a running go at it. We're going to see Saul's pity party. Tell me that these are the words of a leader who you want to be over you. Tell me that these are the words of an emotionally stable man. Verse 6. When Saul heard that David was discovered and the men that were with him, now Saul abode in Gibeah under a tree in Ramah, having his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing about him. I mentioned probably not real sharp, because every time Saul has a javelin or a pointy object in his hand, he tries to kill people with it, as he did to his son once and to David twice that we have recorded. Verse 7, Then Saul said unto his servants that stood about him, Hear now, ye Benjamites. What is Saul? He's a Benjamite. So he's talking to his relatives. Hear now, ye Benjamites, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards, and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds? That all of you have conspired against me, and there is none that showeth me that my son hath made a league with the son of Jesse, and there's none of you that is sorry for me, or showeth unto me that my son hath stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait, as at this day. Do those sound like the words of an emotionally stable leader? None of you feel sorry for me. That's not what you want to hear, but that's what he's saying. Again, Saul is in Gibeah, and he's wondering where David is hiding. At this point, he doesn't know, but rumors are starting to filter back to him, but he doesn't have any actionable information yet. Saul knows that David is on the run, and he probably has heard through the rumor mill where David has been. He probably knows that David was in Gath. He probably knows that David was in Adullam. He has probably heard that David went to Moab. But he doesn't know exactly where David is at this point. Because if he did, he would send his people after him, as we'll see in chapter 23. But Saul is mentally crumbling before the eyes of his court. He's attempting to buy loyalty with land and positions. He's saying, hey, Benjamites, will the son of Jesse, will he give you vineyards? Will he give you land? Will he make you captain over hundreds? Meaning, I'll give you those things, but he won't, so come to my team, is essentially what he's doing. He's upset when word reaches him of Jonathan and David's covenant. You can read about that in chapter 20. By the way, Jonathan and David's covenant was not treasonous. It was a covenant of mutual protection. David told Jonathan, I'll protect you and your family if something happens to you. You do the same for me. But Saul is living in a fantasy world filled with phantom enemies that don't exist. He's antsy, he's paranoid, he's upset, he feels like people are out to get him. Again, David's not out to get him. David is enough of a warrior that if he was out to get Saul, Saul'd be dead. But he's not. And so Saul is living in a world of his own making, in a world of his own imagination. And it's into this perfect storm of paranoia that we read steps Doeg in verse 9. Doeg. Then answered Doeg the Edomite, which was set over the servants of Saul, and said, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. So get the picture with me. Saul is sitting, we read here in verse 6 that he's in Gibeah. He's under a tree, and he's holding a spear, and everybody's standing around him. And he's having this pity party in front of everyone, and he's trying to buy friends and yelling at people for not feeling sorry for him. And into this courtroom drama, Doeg steps up, this Edomite, and he says, I actually saw David. When? Well, it's been a while back. It was in Nob. David came to Nob, and he saw Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. That's where we saw Doeg before. If you look back at 1 Samuel 21, you'll see the whole story. David had just escaped. This was his first escape. He's on his way out, and he's leaving Gibeah, and he'd left so quickly that he didn't have time to gather provisions. He didn't take any weapons. And so he stopped in Nob, which is the place where the tabernacle was. And in Nob, he went into the tabernacle, and he was talking to Ahimelech. Ahimelech is the chief priest of this day. So David is running from Saul, and he stops in Nob and talks to Ahimelech, and he says, I need food. And so Ahimelech gives him the showbread. And so he eats the showbread and gives it to the young men who he was with. And David says, do you have any weapons? He says, I don't have any weapons except for the sword of, you remember? Goliath of Gath. So David says, well, that's a good one, so give me that. So David leaves with a couple of young men, and he leaves with the sword of Goliath. I'm thinking probably on his back, not on his hip, because it was probably as big as he was. So he leaves with the sword, the showbread, and his young men, and they go off into the night. But David had said unto Ahimelech the priest in 1 Samuel 21 verse 2, the king hath commanded me. This is when Ahimelech asked David, why are you here? This was David's response. This matters. This is David's response. And David said unto Ahimelech the priest, the king hath commanded me a business, and hath said unto me, let no man know anything of the business whereabout I send thee. What I have commanded thee, and I have appointed my servants to such and such a place. So, essentially, what did David tell Ahimelech he was doing? I'm on a secret mission for the king, who is Saul. Who is, right in our context, here in chapter 22, he's the one who's having a meltdown when Doeg walks up and says, I saw David in Nob. Ahimelech gave David the stuff, and they continued on their way. But someone had been eavesdropping. It wasn't just David and Ahimelech. We read in 1 Samuel 21, verse 7, this is when David was talking to Ahimelech in the tabernacle. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord. And his name was Doeg, an Edomite, the chiefest of the herdmen that belonged to Saul. So David's private conference with Ahimelech wasn't private. One of Saul's servants, his lead shepherd, was there in the shadows, and he was eavesdropping, and he heard what David said, and he heard what Ahimelech said back. So Doeg had been hearing, and now months later, here he is with Saul in Gibeah, talking about how no one's loyal to him, and Doeg speaks up. He's going to prove his loyalty, because Doeg wants a piece. He wants some of what Saul's offering. He's not a Benjamite, but I'll be loyal. I'm for sale. Look at verse 9 here in chapter 22. Then answered Doeg, the Edomite, which was set over the servants of Saul, and said, I saw the son of Jesse come to Nob, to Ahimelech the son of Ahitub, and he inquired of the Lord for him, and gave him victuals, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. Saul is paranoid, looking for enemies, and Doeg stands up and tattletales on Ahimelech, the priest. So, verse 11, then the king sent to call Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house, the priests that were in Nob, and they came all of them to the king. So it's not just Ahimelech, he also calls everybody else. The total number, we'll get a little bit later in the passage, Ahimelech comes along with 85 other priests. Okay? So all the priests, the whole family, comes at the request of Saul. Now, several times in this book, Ahimelech has been identified as the son of Ahitub. Here's his family tree, once again, just because this matters. Ahimelech is the son of Ahitub, who is the son of Phinehas, who is the son of Eli. Eli, who we read about at the beginning of 1 Samuel, he was the chief priest in Shiloh. But now the tabernacle has moved to Nob, where Ahimelech is now the chief priest. So he would be the great-grandson of Eli. That matters, especially with what's coming next. On Doeg's accusation, all of these men come into his presence in Gibeah. So you have Saul in his delusional, fantasy, paranoid world, now with 85 of God's priests before him. Verse 12. And Saul said, Hear now, thou son of Ahitub. And he answered, Here I am, my lord. Just as a term of respect, notice lowercase Lord. It would be the equivalent of saying, Yes, sir. And Saul said unto him, Why have ye conspired against me? Again, you hear the paranoia coming out here? Why have you conspired against me, thou and the son of Jesse, in that thou hast given him bread and a sword, and hast inquired of God for him, that he should arise against me to lie in wait, as at this day? You're one of them. Why are you going behind my back? Here, why would you do this, Ahimelech? Why are you plotting with David to overthrow me? Well, I would imagine Ahimelech was just as surprised as anyone. What? No, I'm not conspiring with David, because, real quick, what did David say he was doing when he showed up in Nob? He said, I'm on secret business for the king, who is Saul. So Ahimelech standing here, probably confused. What do you mean conspiring with David? Yeah, I helped him. He's one of your generals. Remember, David was over thousands. Ahimelech answers in verse 14. Then Ahimelech answered the king and said, And who is so faithful among thy servants as David, which is the king's son-in-law, and goeth at thy bidding, and is honorable in thine house? Again, he's going off of what David had told him in chapter 21, and he speaks from a position of innocence as well as just common sense. Sire, Your Highness, David's always been your faithful servant. In addition to being your son-in-law, he's family. And why wouldn't I help him? If he asked for it, of course I would help. I would help any of your servants if they came to me. Verse 15. This is still Ahimelech talking. He says, did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Be it far from me, let not the king impute anything unto his servant, nor to all the house of my father, for thy servant knew nothing of all this, less or more. Your Highness, I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't inquire of God for him. He asked for bread, and I gave him the showbread. He asked for a sword, and I gave him the sword of Goliath. And I sent him on his way, and I don't know what you're talking about. Again, we don't have recorded that Ahimelech inquired of God for David, only that he gave him food and weapons, or a weapon. Verse 16, Saul listens to this confused priest pleading innocence, and he said, thou shalt surely die, Ahimelech, thou and all thy father's house. Why? Why? Well, again, Saul is delusional. He's so wrapped up in his sin. He's so deep down in sin, he doesn't know which way's up. He's going to condemn a man and his whole house for doing something that he just said. Why wouldn't I do that? And so Saul attempts mass murder. Verse 17. And the king said unto the footmen that stood about him, turn and slay the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew when he fled, and did not show it to me. But the servants of the king would not put forth their hand to fall upon the priests of the Lord. Listen to what Saul says here in verse 17. Turn and slay the priests of the Lord. The Lord, capital L-O-R-D, meaning Jehovah. Turn and kill the priests of God. And his soldiers say, no, I'm not gonna be the one who kills the priests of Jehovah. He declares that they're part of the grand conspiracy that David is leading against him. But Saul's servants defy his order to his face. They say, no, I'm not doing it. I'm not lifting up my hand. I'm not going to shoot the bow. I'm not going to lift the sword. They won't do it. What do you suppose that did to the mind of Saul? Just go with me in the story. We don't have it recorded, but what do you suppose it did to Saul when his troops, his private troops, said no? You think that went over well? I bet not. I bet it pushed him further out. So this man is not in a stable place at all. Sin has just gone all through Saul, to the point where he's declaring death upon the servants of God. Saul is not to be defeated that easily. Verse 18, and the king said to Doeg, turn thou and fall upon the priests. And Doeg the Edomite turned, and he fell upon the priests, and slew on that day 75 persons that did wear a linen ephod. The fact that Doeg was able to slaughter 85 priests would indicate that he wasn't fighting them in battle. This wasn't a sword fight. This was an execution, where Doeg, this Edomite, the chief shepherd of Saul, murdered 85 of the Lord's priests. When it says that they did wear a linen ephod, remember that the ephod is the uniquely priestly garment. It's not the breastplate, that was worn over the ephod, but they would have worn the ephod. Think of it it was an identifying garment for priests. You could tell a priest, you say, well, he's wearing an ephod. Not necessarily wearing the crown and the mitre and all of the stuff that he would wear in the temple, but they wore the ephod. And so this day he kills 85 persons that did wear the linen ephod. But it didn't end there. It wasn't just the 85 men. Look at verse 19. And Nob, meaning the city. And Nob, the city of the priests, smote he with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and sucklings and oxen and asses and sheep with the edge of the sword. Do you see how out of hand this has gotten? It started out with Saul being paranoid at David, and here we are. He's just had 85 men killed, 85 priests of the Lord, and then Doeg goes to their hometown and he wipes out everyone. He kills men, he kills women, he kills babies, he kills their animals, he kills everything. By the way, look at verse 19 and you hear what he did. He smote with the edge of the sword both men and women, children and suckling, and oxen and asses and sheep with the edge of the sword. If that sounds familiar, it's because it is. If you look at chapter 15, verse 3, this is what God told Saul to do to the Amalekites. He said, now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. But what did Saul do to Amalek? He spared, notably, he spared the king, Agag. What else did he spare? The best of the animals. Well, why? To offer a sacrifice to the Lord, right? That's what he told Samuel. But here, what Saul wouldn't obediently do to God's enemies, he willingly did to God's priests. Do you realize how far he's come? Do you realize this was the Saul who we were reading about just a few chapters ago, who was pretty good. He had a lot of potential. You remember? He was the humble man who wouldn't come out when they wanted to declare him king because he didn't want the office. And here he is. He's just done to God's priests what he wouldn't do to God's enemies. Ahimelech and his family and the town in which they live are butchered at the order of their disturbed king, with one exception. The exception is Abiathar. Take a look at verse 20. And one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. So this would be the great-grandson of Eli. Okay? Ahimelech, one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar showed David that Saul had slain the Lord's priests. Miraculously, one gets away. One of Ahimelech's sons. He makes his way to David. Asking around, he found out where David was. And he makes his way to David. David is, remember, he's in the forest of Hereth. And Abiathar comes and he tracks David down, finds him, and he says to David, they've killed them all. They killed my family. They killed all of my family. My extended family, they've killed everyone. Verse 22. And David said unto Abiathar, I knew it that day, when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul. What's he talking about? He's talking about that time in Nob in chapter 21. David saw Doeg in the shadows. And he says here, I knew it. I knew this would happen. When Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, I have occasioned the death of all the persons of thy father's house. Abide thou with me. Fear not, for he that seeketh my life seeketh thy life. But with me thou shalt be in safeguard. How did David share any responsibility for what had just happened to Ahimelech, his family, and the town of Nob? How did David share any responsibility? He lied. He lied to Ahimelech, and Ahimelech acted on the information that he had. Boy, that's a lot of unexpected consequences from a little white lie, isn't it? A whole city, a whole family, with the exception of one, is wiped off the face of the earth. Because in chapter 21, when Ahimelech told David, what are you doing? David said, I'm on a secret mission for the king. What would have happened if David would have been honest? Well, Ahimelech could have been on his guard. Things could have changed. But David's lie has now come back to haunt him, and certainly to haunt the household of Ahimelech. But David takes Abiathar into his protection, and thus begins a relationship that will last until the end of David's life and into the reign of Solomon. So this relationship between David and Abiathar will go on. David hasn't begun his reign yet. When he does reign, he'll reign for 40 years. So he will have a 50-year relationship with Abiathar, where he will be the man of God for David. It's of significance. Eventually, he will be dismissed by Solomon, David's son. You can read about that in 2 Samuel 20. Now, the question that might come to your mind as we read this is, how could God allow this to happen? Why would God allow this to happen? This massacre of his priests, why would God allow this? How could God allow this paranoid king to order the destruction of almost an entire priestly dynasty? Well, look at verse 11. Who was Ahimelech? He's the son of Ahitub, who is the son of Phinehas, who is the son of Eli. Now, rewind. All the way back, decades, rewind. Before Saul was born, before David was born, when Samuel was just a little boy who was brought by his mother Hannah and dropped off at the tabernacle in Shiloh to be raised by Eli and his two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. Eli was God's high priest. He was of the Levitical tribe. Eli had a lot going for him, but his sons, Hophni and Phinehas, had defiled the sacrifices. And we talked about this back in 1 Samuel 2. They defiled the sacrifices. They were committing fornication with the women who came to offer sacrifices. They were doing it in the gate of the tabernacle. They weren't even hiding it. And what did Eli do? Nothing. Nothing. He let them do it, and God takes that seriously. Eli had failed in his fatherly duties. He had allowed them to do these things without consequence. If you'd like, flip back to 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 30. We're going to find out why 1 Samuel 22 happened the way it did by rewinding decades into the past. In 1 Samuel chapter 2, an unnamed prophet, a man of God, walked into the presence of Eli and condemned him, and the generations that would follow him. 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 30. Wherefore the Lord God of Israel saith, I said indeed that thy house, the house of thy father, should walk before me forever. But now the Lord hath said, be it far from me. For them that honor me I will honor, and they that despise me shall be lightly esteemed. Behold, the days come that I will cut off thine arm and the arm of thy father's house. Get these words. That there shall not be an old man in thine house. Thou shalt see an enemy in thy habitation in all the wealth which God hath given Israel. And there shall not be an old man in thine house forever. And the man of thine whom I shall not cut off from mine altar shall be to consume thine eyes and to grieve thine heart, and all the increase of thine house shall die in the flower of their age. Who was that addressed to? Eli. Why? Because he blew it with his kids. And what did God do? He said, because of what you've done, the generations after you will die in the flower of their age. You won't have old men. You'll just have young men. They'll die young in the house of Eli. And that's exactly what happened. In a day, this generational curse was fulfilled on the house of Eli, only it was the house of Ahimelech, because Eli had died the same day Hophni and Phinehas had. But the generational curse continued on, and on it went. As I mentioned, Abiathar is going to serve into the reign of Solomon. He'll be dismissed by Solomon, and another priest will come in. If you read in the Old Testament, you'll find there's another priest called Zadok. And there's the line of Zadok that will run, and another priest. The line switches, where before God had been using the house of Eli, and that particular run of Levitical priests, God switches. And he uses the household of Eleazar instead. All of this from decades ago in 1 Samuel chapter 2.
Well, it wasn't Ahimelech one of those priests?
Ahimelech was.
So why, so did he not get judged? Did he not, David said, I'll protect you.
Abiathar was one of those priests. And he would also, Ahimelech was the father who died. Abiathar was his son who came into David's protection. And Abiathar would live, and he would serve as priest in the tabernacle under David, but then he would be dismissed in judgment under Solomon. Because if you read ahead, Abiathar picks the wrong son of David, and he backs the wrong heir.
What about the curse that God said those people weren't going to live to their old age?
Well, he also says that those who do live will be for an example. And Abiathar, he died in disgrace. His was not, he made it. God allowed him. He didn't live to a grand old age like David did, but he lived, we would say, he lived a reasonably full life and then died in disgrace, as is said here. There's more of the curse than we have read here this evening. If you go back to 1 Samuel 2, you can read there's even more where it adds on a few more caveats to what God said would happen. Good thought, though. Any other questions before we pull some application here? Kind of interesting, isn't it? How everything comes together. Remember when we started this study, I said, watch for generational blessings and watch for generational curses. And we almost forget about this. I remember reading this passage when I was just much younger and thinking, why on earth would God allow this to happen? And then realized through some study, oh, God allowed this to happen because it was prophesied that this would happen. And it will continue to happen, as we'll see going on here through this. 3 things to get here as application. I alluded to this just earlier. Saul should be a cautionary tale to each and every one of us. Just not that long ago, chapter 10, verse 22, they were going to declare Saul to be king and anoint him before the people, and it says that he had hid himself among the stuff. Okay? And he's just ordered the extermination of an entire town of God's priests. What happened? Well, sin happened. Pride, disobedience, defiance of God's orders happened, and it has taken Saul. He had kind of a meteoric rise, didn't he? He went from nothing to king real fast. And he's gone from king with lots of potential to a paranoid maniac, essentially, who's ordering the butchery of men and women, of children, and of animals. Why? Because he's off because of sin. That's something, that should be a cautionary tale. Sin always moves faster and it always goes farther than we think it will. There was a preacher years ago who preached a message called Pet Sins Become Killer Monsters. And they do. We say, I can handle this. It's okay. I can deal with this. And the next thing you know, it's turned into something that's just over the top. Don't allow yourself to go down that path. Allow Saul to be a cautionary tale to you. Number 2, David's little white lie to Ahimelech had some pretty dire consequences, didn't it? Does God need our dishonesty to protect us? We've covered this. This same lesson keeps coming up. Michael lied to Saul to protect David. David lied to protect himself. It never works out. God doesn't need your lies. God is sovereign enough to protect us as we walk in obedience to His Word. Remember that. And then lastly, Deuteronomy chapter 7 verse 9 says, Know therefore that the Lord thy God, He is God, the faithful God, which keepeth covenant and mercy with them that love Him, and keep His commandments to 1,000 generations. God remembers His promises very, very well. When God says, if you do this, I'll bless you, and then you do that, you say, well, God forgot about it. No, God doesn't forget about it. He keeps covenant to 1,000 generations. If you go to Deuteronomy, read verse 10. There's the other side of the coin. He'll also rain down terror upon those who disobey Him. Both sides are true. We serve a covenant-keeping God, and I'm glad of that. Because, you know, God makes an awful lot of covenants to you and me right here. And I can say, you know what? I haven't experienced the answer to all of them in my life personally. But I know that He'll keep them. I know that I serve a God who keeps His covenants. In this case, we have a negative example. God made a covenant with the house of Eli. I'm going to judge you. You won't have an old man. You won't have anybody who rises in popularity and stays there. That's exactly what happened. Most of them, in this case, 85 less 1, so 84, died. And Abiathar would end up dying in disgrace later on. So, remember, we serve a covenant-keeping God. Any thoughts, questions, or comments before we wrap it up here this evening? Kind of an interesting portion of Scripture. I enjoy going over these portions. Next week, we're going to go and we're going to see David is going to be found. Saul's going to find where David is, and we'll see what happens following that. Well, let's bow for a word of prayer here this evening. Our Father God, we thank You for all of the accounts of Your Word. Lord, for how it sobers us to think that we serve a covenant-keeping God. Lord, there's very definitely a bright side to that. Lord, that You will keep all of the promises that You've made. Lord, the promise that You'll never leave us nor forsake us. The promise that You'll hear our prayers. The promise that You love us. Lord, I pray that You'd help us to remember the other side of that as well. Lord, that You're a God who hates sin and who will judge sin. I pray that we would be learning our lesson as we go through this study from Saul, Lord, of how fast things accelerate when we start to obey the flesh instead of the Spirit. Lord, I pray that You do a work in our hearts. I pray that You give us a good week ahead, Lord, as we go into the celebration of Your birth with Christmas. Lord, I pray that You would just help us to have opportunities to be a blessing to others in this time. I pray that You would help us to speak the gospel to those we come in contact with. In Jesus' name, amen.